Hello, and welcome to part 2 of The Origins of Christmas. I'm your host, Danny Payne, and this is On the Origin of Everything. In part 1, I covered the ancient origins of Christmas, and today I'll focus on the more modern origins of Christmas. Before we jump in, I've got one more quick ancient origin that I found fascinating. You know how Christmas is sometimes written as Xmas? I remember first seeing that as a kid when watching old Christmas cartoon episodes of Tom and Jerry and the Flintstones, and wondered what that was about. I recall adults complaining that Xmas was literally taking Christ out of Christmas. But actually, Xmas is a throwback to early Christianity. Christos is a Greek word meaning the anointed one, which is what Christ means, the title given to Jesus. Christos is spelled with an X, and at that time, it was common to abbreviate the names of deities. This type of abbreviation is called nomina sacra. X is even present in some of the earliest manuscripts of the New Testament. So Xmas became shorthand for Christ's Mass. Using Xmas in the 20th century wasn't meant to secularize Christmas, it was a callback to its ancient roots. And aside from its classic vintage feel, Xmas was also more practical. Christmas contains a lot of characters, making Xmas a better alternative in print and in cartoon animations. So that's the origin of Xmas. Cool, huh? Alright, let's leave the ancient world and move on to some modern origins. We know that Christmas trees were originally decorated with paper roses, apples, and sweets, and later candles. Candles were eventually replaced by electric lights. The first electrically lit Christmas tree was created by Thomas Edison's colleague, Edward H. Johnson, in 1882 in New York. This wasn't a public event like the famous Rockefeller Center tree lighting. This was a private affair in Edward Johnson's house, but it drew a lot of press. Here is an eyewitness account. Last evening, I walked over beyond Fifth Avenue and called at the residence of Edward H. Johnson, vice president of Edison's Electric Company. There, at the rear of the beautiful parlors, was a large Christmas tree, presenting a most picturesque and uncanny aspect. It was brilliantly lighted with many colored globes, about as large as an English walnut, and was turning some 6 times a minute on a little pine box. There were 80 lights in all, encased in these dainty glass eggs, and about equally divided between white, red, and blue. As the tree turned, the colors alternated, all the lamps going out and being relit at every revolution. The result was a continuous twinkling of dancing colors, red, white, and blue, all evening. I need not tell you that the scintillating evergreen was a pretty sight. One can hardly imagine anything prettier. The tree was kept revolving by a little hidden crank below the floor, which was turned by electricity. It was a superb exhibition. What a futuristically magical thing to see. Electric lights are something you and I take for granted, but to someone in the late 1800s, an electrically lit Christmas tree would have been quite the sight. I should say that hand-wiring 80 lights and engineering an electric motor to make the tree spin wasn't done just for fun. Edward Johnson, as the vice president of the Edison Electric Light Company, was demonstrating that Edison's electrical system could be used safely domestically, not just industrially. This first electrically lit Christmas tree was an intentional and successful marketing campaign. Despite the attention it received, Christmas lights didn't catch on immediately as they were very expensive. It cost about $2,000 in today's money to don a Christmas tree with electric lights. It also required a wireman, the term for an electrician at the time. Just like any brand new technology, only the wealthy could afford it. In 1903, General Electric began selling pre-wired Christmas light sets to be used commercially in public spaces, department stores, and hotels. These were still expensive as they were professional grade and required a wireman to install. But in 1905, the American Eveready Company released a more affordable, plug-and-play version for the average consumer, and this marked the birth of the Christmas light strings we buy today. The slow replacement of candles with electric lights began. By the 1920s and 30s, Christmas lights were everywhere, commercially and domestically. It's hard to imagine Christmas without Christmas lights. It gets pretty cold in the winter where I live, and part of the Christmas experience for me has always involved freezing my butt off in early December putting up Christmas lights on the house. But it has also involved driving around neighborhoods looking at Christmas lights while listening to Christmas music. There is no Christmas without Christmas lights in my mind. So thank you, Edward H. Thomas and the American Ever-Ready Company, apparently. Moving on to the modern origins of Santa Claus. We know that the direct ancestor of Santa Claus was Sinterklaas, the Dutch word for St. Nicholas. But how did we get from Sinterklaas to Santa Claus? Well, the newspaper publishers in America needed to come up with an English spelling for Sinterklaas, resulting in a few spelling variations. The earliest surviving mention of one of these names dates back to 1773 in the New York Gazette, reporting, "Last Monday, the anniversary of St. Nicholas, otherwise called St. A. Claus, was celebrated at Protestant Hall." That spelling was St.A. Claus. Over the next few decades, other publications would spell it Santa Claus, 2 words, Sante Claus, St. A Claus, St. Claus, or Santy Claus, 1 word. Washington Irving spelled it Santa Claus, like we would spell it now, only 1 word, in an 1807 periodical. And then he did something that changed the course of Santa Claus history forever. In his famous satirical book, A History of New York in 1809, Washington Irving recast St. Nicholas as the patron saint of the old Dutch settlers of New Amsterdam. If you listened to my episode on basketball, you'll recall that this book was written in the voice of the fictional historian Diedrich Knickerbocker, which gave New Yorkers their nickname. In this same book, a character sees a vision of St. Nicholas, quote, riding over the tops of trees in that selfsame wagon wherein he brings his yearly presents to children, end quote. The smoke of St. Nicholas's pipe rose into the air and, quote, spread like a cloud overhead, over a great extent of country. The smoke assumed a variety of marvelous forms, domes and lofty spires. And when St. Nicholas had smoked his pipe, he twisted it in his hatband, and laying his finger beside his nose, then mounting his wagon, he returned over the treetops and disappeared. End quote. In this story, the dream or vision was interpreted as a prophecy that the New Amsterdam settlement would grow to become a booming metropolis. Because this book was so influential, Irving effectively moved St. Nicholas from an abstract European saint to a local legend, someone to call their own. It also opened the door for later writers to riff on the Santa Claus character. In part 1, I explained that it was in the United States that the many St. Nicholas traditions of the Old World were consolidated to create the Santa Claus we know today. And this depiction of St. Nicholas in Irving's book kicked off this consolidation. By the way, what's the deal with putting his finger on the side of his nose? I found out that gesture comes from various European traditions that could mean a few different things. In folklore, it was linked to supernatural acts, like invoking magic. It makes me think of Samantha on Bewitched, the way she would wiggle her nose before using magic. And I swear I'm not that old. I've already mentioned the Flintstones and Tom and Jerry, and now Bewitched. I just watched a lot of TV growing up, and reruns of these old shows were always on. Anyway, that finger beside the nose thing could also silently convey, I know something you don't know, or that you shared a secret knowledge with someone. This gesture appears in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, in Shakespeare's plays, and other Middle English literature. This is where touching our noses when playing charades comes from. So when St. Nicholas placed his finger beside his nose and flew away on his wagon, he was both casting a spell and giving a sort of knowing nod regarding the prophetic message about New Amsterdam. Alright, so Washington Irving's depiction of St. Nicholas as a magical patron of the Dutch settlement was monumental to the story of Santa Claus, but it was only the beginning. Irving would continue to write about Christmas. Between 1819 and 1820, he wrote short stories presenting an embellished, romanticized Old English Christmas, centered around family and festive merriment. This, quote, authentic Christmas style was appealing to Americans who were looking to adopt new traditions. You may or may not know this already, but Christmas had turned into a drunken, disorderly affair from the medieval period on. far removed from a reverent observance of the holy birth of Christ. The Puritans in America suppressed these types of celebrations, deeming them morally corrupt and unbiblical. So, when Washington Irving presented Americans with a whitewashed, wholesome version of an old English Christmas, people ate it up. They wanted to celebrate by sharing a big feast with family and friends, and decorate with evergreens and mistletoe, roaring fires, including the traditional Yule log, dancing and caroling in a beautiful estate in the country, a country Christmas. That's what Washington Irving gave to America with his stories. Another influential publication came in 1821 called The Children's Friend, A New Year's Present to the Little Ones from 5 to 12. It was actually a poem with illustrations sold as a booklet for 25 cents and contained the earliest known visual representations of Santa Claus. He was dressed in red clerical robes and wore a furry hat with Santa Claus written across the front. On a sleigh pulled by a single reindeer, he flew over rooftops, going house to house on Christmas Eve, bringing presents for the good kids. But for the bad kids, he'd leave a birchen rod, which is a bundle of flexible sticks used for brutally whipping the snot out of someone. That's what Santa Claus left for the naughty kids, or rather, for their parents, to use on them. It makes getting coal seem not so bad. But this little poem was a landmark in the development of the American Santa Claus. And maybe you caught this, or maybe you didn't, but why is it titled A New Year's Present to the Little Ones from 5 to 12 when the story takes place on Christmas Eve? I'll answer that right after this. This episode is brought to you by Nothing. To help keep ads off this show, consider donating by clicking the Patreon link in the show notes, or by going to patreon.com/ontheoriginofeverything. Another way you can support this show is by giving it a 5-star rating and review, or by following it or sharing it. Let's build a community of people that are curious and always learning. Now, back to the show. So, why was that influential poem titled as a New Year's gift-giving event when it took place on Christmas Eve? In the early 1800s in America and in England, it was customary to give gifts on New Year's, whereas Christmas was generally treated as a strictly religious holiday or as an excuse to get wasted by some. So this poem's title was appealing to its audience's existing shopping habits. Remember St. Nicholas Day on December 6th, where gift-giving was practiced as well? Remember how Martin Luther had tried to replace the Catholic tradition with his Christmas Eve Christkindl creation? He didn't succeed in getting everyone to make the switch. Some did, but not everyone. So there were a lot of different observances happening in December, and this poem contributed to the eventual adoption of gift-giving on Christmas Eve. If you get a chance, you should look up that poem. It's not very long. There's another poem that was even more influential, so influential that we're all still aware of it today. Widely known as The Night Before Christmas, it was originally published in 1823 with the title Account of a Visit from St. Nicholas. Can you believe this poem turned 200 years old in 2023? That's some staying power. This famous poem gave us a number of firsts, like St. Nick's white beard, his round belly, 8 reindeer pulling the sleigh instead of just the one, the names of each reindeer, the act of entering through the chimney, and putting presents in the stockings. These were all brand new ideas. But if you're like me, you never noticed that St. Nicholas in this poem is described as being an elf, not a tall, burly grandfather figure. And his sleigh and 8 reindeer were miniature. St. Nick was a little buddy. That's how he could fit down the chimneys. Check out these lines. When what to my wondering eyes did appear, but a miniature sleigh and 8 tiny reindeer. And he was chubby and plump, a right jolly old elf. And I laughed when I saw him, in spite of myself. It's crazy that I never thought twice about those lines before. You might not have ever known about the St. Nicholas story in Irving's A History of New York, and you might not have ever heard of the Children's Friend poem. But just as you were familiar with the Night Before Christmas poem, I'm positive you're also familiar with this next one. In 1843, Charles Dickens released A Christmas Carol. This book didn't add anything to the Santa Claus character, but it expanded on earlier writings I've mentioned, portraying a Christmas that was centered on family, wholesome festivity, charity, and goodwill. It popularized the concept of the Christmas spirit, of generosity and moral reflection. I have a memory of being in middle school, and when my English teacher announced that we were going to watch A Christmas Carol, I did a fist pump and went, "Yes!" because I thought she meant A Christmas Story. Very different. I got some weird looks from my classmates, but my teacher was very impressed with my enthusiasm. Imagine my disappointment and embarrassment when the movie started playing and I realized my mistake. Middle school is hard enough without doing stupid things like that. The interpretations of Santa Claus in the 19th century were numerous, ranging from elf-like to human, from riding on a wagon to riding on a sleigh, being pulled by a horse, a single reindeer, or multiple reindeer, from being able to fly to not being able to fly, and what he wore and what he looked like wasn't standardized quite yet either. We owe the modern image of Santa Claus to a German-American illustrator and editorial cartoonist named Thomas Nast. He created the Republican elephant and popularized the Democratic donkey with his illustrations. But he's mostly remembered for his drawings of Santa Claus. From 1863 to 1886, he published dozens of illustrations depicting Santa as a big-bellied, jolly, white-bearded man smoking a Dutch pipe, wearing a furry suit with white trim. He introduced some backstory for Santa as well, like his North Pole workshop, helper elves, and the naughty or nice list. If you look up Thomas Nast Santa Claus, you'll be like, "Yep, that's the classic Santa Claus." But if you see any of his work in color, just know that those were later colorizations. Thomas Nast's original work was all in black and white. By the late 1800s, Nast's Santa had become firmly embedded in American culture, and his imagery provided the visual foundation for 20th century advertisers like Coca-Cola to further expand on it. Starting in 1931, during the holiday season, Coca-Cola pumped out full-color ads with Santa in a red and white suit, reinforcing both Coca-Cola's brand and Santa's image. They ran these ads annually for decades, cementing the red and white Santa as a global icon. Now, have you noticed that the development of Santa Claus in America omitted the Dark Companion? European St. Nicholas traveled with a sidekick responsible for punishing bad behavior, sometimes in very violent ways. But this figure disappeared from the mythology in America. Why? Historians suggest this was due to cultural shifting caused by the Reformation and the Enlightenment, which emphasized personal conscience and rational morality, moving away from fear-based discipline in favor of benevolence and moral persuasion. My own thoughts on this are that the new Santa figure mirrors the Christian God, someone who's always watching, judging good and bad behavior, rewarding the righteous and punishing the wicked. But overall, he's a benevolent being. I feel like Santa absorbed the role of the punishing sidekick and reduced the punishment's severity to withholding presents on Christmas. This is all conjecture, of course. What we can say for sure is that Santa Claus in America shed his dark companion, but it would be replaced by a light companion, if you will, the glowing red nose of Rudolph. Rudolph was created out of whole cloth in 1939 by Montgomery Ward, the major retailer. They set out to distribute a little booklet for children as a giveaway for marketing purposes, and asked a copywriter, Robert May, to write an original Christmas-themed story for the booklet. The story he wrote reflected his own personal feelings as an outsider. You see, Robert May was a secular Jewish person in a time when there was considerable pressure to assimilate to Protestant beliefs and culture, and Jewish families often experienced discrimination and exclusion. Robert May was also an aspiring writer, but was stuck in a corporate role writing copy, feeling undervalued and overlooked. Inspired by his own frustrations, his story of Rudolph is one of inclusion that also celebrates being different. It's got an inspiring underdog message in which the weakness of having a glowing nose becomes a strength that ultimately saves the day. Montgomery Ward distributed 2.4 million copies of the Rudolph booklet in the first year alone. Robert May's hopeful story resonated with the public, and what began as a retail promotion turned into one of the most enduring holiday characters in history. Rudolph's story had a happy ending, and you could say the same for Robert May, because Montgomery Ward gave him the rights to Rudolph in 1947, an unusual act of corporate generosity. Then, in 1949, his brother-in-law, Johnny Marks, wrote the song Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, recorded by none other than Gene Autry, which sold millions of copies. And as if Rudolph needed any more help, in 1964, the TV special further entrenched Rudolph in American holiday culture. Last night we watched Frosty the Snowman, another mid-century creation inspired by the success of Rudolph. We then watched A Charlie Brown Christmas, a favorite of mine, mostly for the music by Vince Guaraldi. Great stuff. There are many interesting themes in A Charlie Brown Christmas, like anti-consumerism, Charlie Brown's depression, and the message that small, imperfect things like the crummy little tree Charlie Brown picked out, and Charlie Brown himself, could be transformed by love. It also brought the focus of a commercialized Christmas back to the Christian meaning of Christmas, complete with recitations of Bible verses of the birth story of Jesus. Executives thought this thing was going to be a total flop because it had jazz music, which was unheard of, especially for a kids' show, and it had child voice actors, and was explicitly religious. But it was a huge hit. I think many Americans appreciated its authenticity and the reminder to put Christ back in Christmas, feeling that Christmas had become too commercial. Christmas happens to be my favorite holiday. It's my favorite because it's got something for everyone. Whether you come for the faith, the folklore, the family traditions, or the excuse to shower your loved ones with gifts, Christmas invites everyone to the table. Take my buddy George, for example. He's never been religious, but he loves Christmas. I think it's cool that someone could go to midnight mass, then wake up the next morning to open presents. I've done that, and I'm not even Catholic. The Christmas spirit is real. There's a general sense of goodwill and generosity that makes everyone a little happier and a little kinder. And I love that Christmas didn't come fully formed, that it was stitched together over centuries, from ancient winter festivals to Santa Claus and Rudolph. It's been really fun putting this episode together. I'm excited for future Christmas episodes to cover all the stuff I couldn't fit into this one. So that's it for today. I'm gonna go wrap some more presents while listening to Vince Guaraldi. Merry Christmas to you and your kin. Until next time, so long. Research, music, and production was all done by Jezere Wilson. This podcast is listener-supported, owned and operated by Jez and myself under the On the Origin of Everything LLC in the United States. All rights reserved. We can be reached via email at info@ontheoriginpod.com.